finally, let me try and paint a picture for you, as I'm the self-designated representative of young people, although obviously the eloquent and elegant Wadid disproves that. Let's imagine 20 years in the future, and let's have this construct of an embryonic terrorist, because probably if we are 20 years in the future, they would be an embryo now. First off, they would probably be brought up on some kind of immersive computer gaming experience. And they may find that the circumstances in which they're living gives them reason to have a grievance about something, either their social situation, their family situation, some other kind of situation that we can't even imagine. But essentially they're either bored, fed up, but they live in this virtual world. And to relieve their angst, they decide to take part in a violent computer game or a violent computer simulation. And they're being monitored by some kind of social network. And there's a bunch of bad actors that want to use a social network to weaponize these kinds of people, unbeknownst to them. So an AI agent starts getting involved and interacts with the person and starts taking them on a journey through their gaming experience that results in them starting to act like a terrorist because it's cool. And all of a sudden they find that they've got lots of followers and a small social network building up around how well they do. And they can start building up likes and scores. And if they get a high enough score, they can become a real Jason Bourne, or whatever the equivalent is in 20 years' time. So they continue on with this, but the immersive experience means that they can actually go out into the real world using some kind of device that augments their view of the world, be it contact lenses that provide virtual reality or augmented reality over the real world view of things. And they're encouraged to actually carry out these acts against society to help satisfy their grievances. And all of a sudden they find that maybe there's a video game deal available in the offing because they're so successful. Look at the number of likes they've got. Look at the number of followers. If they keep building in this virtual world, which is starting to be overlaid onto the real world, and they start committing real acts, this all self-reinforces their self-belief in this crazy narrative that this is their way of making a statement and building their reputation in the world. And I think that sooner or later they'll discover that, again, the bad actors that have weaponized them are starting to select targets for them because number of votes says this is a more popular target than that one over there. And so it's not a leap of imagination. The technology to do this already exists. The willingness of people to live in these worlds, particularly young people, is already there. And we need to think very carefully about how we work with these technologies, these networks, and understand that this is a possibility and what we can do to try and prevent that. So to me, that's a potential black swan in the world of terrorism. Hopefully it won't come to that, but you never know. So as far as trying to connect any dots, that was where I ended up, listening to the various presentations that have gone on today. That as we try and learn more and more about what motivates these people, the worlds that they inhabit, we need to be careful that that is going to be augmented or changed dramatically by a technological landscape that is very, very low cost to become part of, irrespective of where you are on the planet and the social circumstances that you find yourself in. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank the organisers very much for a fascinating conference and hand over to my illustrious partner here.
Thank you, Ken. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to connect up the dots. I'm probably going to throw the dots in the air and hope they land somewhere. But I can't predict, as in this uncertain world, this disrupted world, where the dots are going to land and how they're going to land. I thought I would try and broaden the kind of message we might all take away from here, beyond just terrorism, to what we've heard in the last 30 hours or so. And take a cue from Peter Neumann's final thoughts when he talked about tectonic changes. He was referring to the Middle East, but tectonic changes, as he put it, the entire landscape being recrafted. But it's not just in the Middle East, it's every single aspect, I'd suggest, of all we've considered. And I'd like to sort of throw the dots in your direction, because really we've seen an extraordinary downloading of trends, of experiences, of analysis. And Peter Klimek yesterday talking about we must change now what prediction is. And that means from now, as we all leave here in Singapore one way or the other, the idea that from Nakarani-san, that the issue is predicting the unpredictable now. And that needs to be taken away from here as well. From Noah as well, the end of the 20th century framing and so much that's assumed. It's disintegrating at what he called an exponential rate. This is what has been put before you, the speed of change, the massive transformational change. And in this age of digital hyperconnectivity, we can't take comfortable refuge anymore, I'd suggest to you, in the seismic change every 50 years, which is what we heard from Victor Aliyev yesterday. His version explaining the inexplicable. I'd suggest that saying that this is going to happen every 50 years, we can somehow ride it, is really not very helpful in this hyper-connected environment which we're all living in, and the next generation is certainly relying upon to communicate and create viral communities at a moment's notice, which can affect all of you as corporate and political leaders. I'd like to pick up again, as I did at 12:30, from what Thomas from the World Economic Forum was saying on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, that footnote again, right at the end, and I suspect he really wanted to say much more, that new challenge for leadership of values, purpose, and technology. Because I'd like to make that the theme of the next few minutes here, because I think there's a danger of a comfort zone, even in so-called foresight departments, wherever you're working. That linear projection will somehow cover all bases and provide you with the kind of projection that you and those you're serving, either in the C-suite or in government, will feel comfortable with. I think that's a wholly flawed judgment to be making in this new environment. It's fundamentally flawed, as the scale of Lynn Wells's list yesterday of the 7 disruptive technologies coming down the track made very clear the enormity of the value, but the enormity of the disruption as well. But under Moore's law, it ain't going to happen in 10 years, it's going to happen in 10 months. And who's going to be prepared for that? How prepared are you? And Lynn's observations were everything, quote, is exceeding people's ability to handle their lives. Progress is outstripping the capability of governance systems. And that, I would suggest to you, is what needs to go away from here, picking up what Thomas said about leadership. All of you in the coziness, dare I say, of assumed, guaranteed government, corporate, academic, institutional jobs. Self-analysis here is critical about what you can do, what you see, and how your system is going to cope with this. You're all being challenged. You will be challenged, and must assume, I think, that the gap between you and your electors, your taxpayers, your shareholders, your consumers is widening, and that makes it a very vulnerable environment, which we haven't really fully touched upon, I think. I'm doing this big project, not predicting the unpredictable or explaining the inexplicable, but thinking the unthinkable. And our main finding, after 450 hours of interviews and 3,500 pages of transcript, is this: that the conformity which gets people to the top in many ways disqualifies people from understanding the enormity of what they face. And I can tell you, and I can't see any of your faces here, but that when we talk about that in brainstormings and behind closed doors, there's an awful lot of nodding of heads. Not many people speak, but an awful lot of nodding of heads, that the conformity is holding back the ability to engage with the kind of positiveness that's needed with this enormity of what Peter put on the agenda at the beginning, these tectonic changes. But it's not only about thinking the unthinkable, it's about thinking the unpalatable as well. and ensuring the empowered processes are in place to make sure they're not buried in political convenience, but issues to be embraced are embraced, however uncomfortable, because we see a lot of unpalatability out there. Some of the things that have been put on the agenda here, frankly, are not actively being considered because it won't affect us. It'll come down the track after I've left this job. But mindsets, cultures, and behaviors are now, in many ways, inappropriately and destructively calibrated for much, I think, of what we've discussed here over the last 30 hours. Let me give you one example: migration in Europe. I witnessed Antonio Guterres when he was head of the UNHCR at the Ditchley Foundation just over 2 years ago. He was amazing, talking for an hour without notes about the migration crisis which was about to hit Europe. European leaders didn't want to listen. They were too busy saving the euro. And that was made clear, particularly in Berlin, until the middle of August that year. You'll all remember the details. But the fact is that migration crisis has become an existential threat to many governments in Europe. It was not unthinkable, it was unpalatable, and it was set to one side. And now many political leaders are paying the price. How does that get on the agenda when you have the person who's in charge, along with the the Organization for Migration, making the same kind of warning? And there are plenty of other examples around. And I remember the former head of policy planning at the German Foreign Ministry, who invited me to go and give a presentation just over a year ago, Thomas Bagger. He's now working for the President, Steinmeier, in Germany. He said at the beginning of last year, the problem we have as people working for government is that we in Germany, we in Berlin, we're assuming a degree of tranquility, as he put it. Tranquility. Migration isn't going to be a problem. Russia's not going to be a problem. It's been a stark wake-up call, and now we're seeing the difficulties in a place like Germany. Peter Ho said right at the beginning, we work in a system that respects hierarchies. I'd put to you that respecting hierarchies is now a real encumbrance to the kind of things that you all face, at whichever level you're working, and that's certainly based on the kind of research that I'm doing in cooperation with NTU here. And what Kishore Mahbubani said right at the beginning, power is shifting, but government systems are fossilized. Unpalatability again. And these problems, those hierarchies, are the conformity that really is dramatically hampering the abilities, I'd put to you, to confront those new realities. Just think of some of the language that can be used in meetings that some of you attend. We don't want to hear that. That's a wacky idea. Why not say, actually, that's a wise idea? No, that person's a maverick. We can't listen to him or her. Actually, that person may be a visionary in this new environment, a visionary who understands many of the things that we've been hearing here. That idea is bonkers. Actually, it may be the bold idea which should be on the agenda, not the unpalatable distraction that there is. So I put to you that actually these are actually potentially existential threats for governance and also for corporates. And it's not me who's saying that, it's many of the leaders themselves privately who, frankly, to us, have declared how scared they are about what they have to confront, their responsibility to shareholders, their responsibility to electors. They've got to think short term, but what they see coming down the track is something which is far longer term. Let me quote to you a good friend of Singapore, Lord Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal in Britain. I heard him on a platform recently. He is one of the brainchilds of an extraordinarily important development which is well known to Peter and others here, called CESA, which is the Existential Risk Centre at Cambridge University. And he talked about the new big challenges to governance. And governance is about people. It's not about systems, it's about people. And someone like Stephen Fry, the very distinguished comedian and actor and also wise thinker, who's talking about a great transformation which is underway in human society. But what's the pain of all of this? The pain of all of this is the human side of this. People like you sitting in this room, I know we're on the record here, about behavior, culture, and mindset. And I can only share with you the tip of the iceberg of the kind of things we've been talking about, we've been hearing in our research. Let me just quote to you an email I got just before I was due to give a presentation right up at the top of the Westfield Tower in Sydney a few weeks ago. I'm watching a good number of business and state leaders managing clear symptoms of distress, stress, and depression a sinister and most invisible issue for performance out there. So that's where we're at. Conformity shouldn't be a career booster. It's actually becoming a career killer, potentially, and a reputation killer, and when it comes to capacities and skills. And I come back to that word again, existential, whichever way you want to look at it. And coming down the track is what Lynn and others have talked about with artificial intelligence and algorithms and the impact that that's all going to have. So I come back to that one phrase I used right at the beginning yesterday, given to us by a very senior leader facing exactly the kind of challenges that we've been discussing here. He said, faced with what I've got to do, I've got to compress many months, possibly a couple of years of reform and work into a very short process because it's an existential threat. As he said, it's like eating an elephant in one mouthful. Such is the enormity of what is facing all of us. It is about a new awareness. It is about a new flexibility. It's about a new breadth. It's about a new receptiveness to modify what you do and how you do it right at the top. But we're the lucky ones. We're sitting here. There are many others who are pounding the floors 9 to 5, who maybe haven't got time to even think about the kind of things that we're thinking about here. That's a big challenge. We're the lucky ones who have had time to think about it. But out there, those in governments and those in civil services and those in corporates don't have time because they're running hard to stand still. I leave you with a couple more thoughts. When Steve Bannon, the chief strategist for Donald Trump, is talking about the deconstruction of the administrative state, I'd put to you that that's something that many governments and others around the world are looking at with deep foreboding and worrying and wondering also if they can get away with it. The deconstruction of the administrative state. And we know what that means with appointments which are not being made in the United States. It could happen elsewhere as well. And what about oil? We haven't really talked about oil. Look at the existential threat to many nations now, with oil stuck at around $41, $42 a barrel. The real push for renewables now, what's it going to mean to many of the countries like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Venezuela? The existential threat there as well. So that's what I would take away in not joining the dots, but throwing the dots up in the air and hoping they land in some kind of new order, which all of us can take away with some degree of comfort, because at least we've started considering it. I think the real problem is going to be multiplying what we've learned here well beyond these doors, wherever we're working and in the communities and in the processes that we're all involved in. I take away, I think, one working principle, which I find difficult to pronounce, but it's Teotwaki, the end of the world as we know it. It came up a few times on the screen there. It's not the end of the world, but as we know it. It's a new normal, it's ill-defined, but I wonder where it'll be a year or two from now. This time last year, we weren't talking about Donald Trump becoming president. We'd only just started coming to terms with what happened with Brexit in the United Kingdom. There are many uncertainties and unknowns coming down the track, but how well prepared are we all for that? Peter and all your colleagues, thank you very much indeed, I'm sure on behalf of everyone here, for inviting us to a very rich debate, which will resonate as we get on our planes or on the underground to wherever we're going. Thank you very much indeed.